This video is brought to you by Devout Decals, makers of reusable Catholic art for your home altar, your bedroom, and your home classroom.
Exorcism is always a tricky topic to talk about as Catholics. After all, there's really only so much a typical layperson needs to know. Exorcism is best discussed, I think, in the context of spiritual warfare. There are forces, princes and principalities, the preternatural, meaning the demonic, that are out to drag and ensnare your soul to eternal perdition. This is something that we should remember. It can also be a useful topic for really seeing how far things have gone. I have for you an excerpt from Malachi Martin's most infamous work, possibly, Hostage to the Devil. It's his landmark work on exorcists, an exorcism. He reportedly thought it had been the whole subject was a bunch of bunk. He'd been a fairly normal, liberal Jesuit. He thought the whole subject was bunk, basically. He set out, from what I remember seeing him say in an interview, to actually debunk the need for exorcisms. And in so doing, observed exorcisms being said firsthand and had a radical conversion to traditional or very conservative Catholicism. That is our context for this. He's writing this for the reissue of his book, because it was published in the 1970s, but this is the introduction for the reissue of the book in the 1990s. And he talks about how far the world has gone since the initial edition of the book was released. In that decade and a half to 2 decades, the world changed dramatically. How about in the intervening 4 decades since this reissue was issued? How far has the world changed? Listen to his account of things and see how much worse it is now than it was then. Or maybe it's gotten better. Let me know what you think. Possession and exorcism in America in the 1990s. In the blink of God's eye, since Hostage to the Devil was first published in 1976, nothing has changed on the one hand, and everything has changed on the other. Nothing has changed in the process by which an individual is possessed by personal and intelligent evil. Nothing has changed either in the requirements for successful exorcism of a possessed individual. All of that remains as described and summarized in the chapters and cases that follow. What have changed are the conditions of the society in which we all now live. To a far greater degree than most of us could have imagined 15 or so years ago, a favorable climate for the occurrence of demonic possession has developed as the normal condition of our lives. In 1976, Satanism was presented and was probably regarded by most Americans as a box office and bookstore draw. In fact, Hostage to the Devil was intended as a clear warning that possession is not, nor was it ever, some tale of dark fancy featuring ogres and happy endings. Possession is real, and real prices are paid. Now, in America of the 1990s, there is little question of demonic possession as an entertainment. Among families everywhere and at every level of society, there is instead a justifiable fear. Most of all, this is fear for children, and in point of fact, there are few families not already affected in some way by the followers of Satan. Even by the ritualistic deeds the followers of Satan perform in their formal ceremonies and rites, and organized by individuals and groups in professed worship of Satan. For obvious reasons, we don't know everything about organized Satanist groups, or covens as they are called, in the United States, but the ample knowledge we do have justifies the fear among average families for their children and their way of life in the future. We know, for example, that throughout all 50 states of the Union, there are now something over 8,000 Satanist covens. We know that in any major American city or large town, a black mass, almost always organized by covens, is available on a weekly basis at least, and at several locations. We know that the average membership of Satanist covens is drawn from all the professions as well as from among politicians, clergy, and religious. We know further that within those covens a certain amount of specialization has come about. One can choose either a James Martin type coven or one more according to nature. For example, in at least 3 major cities, members of the clergy have at their disposal at least one McCarrick-type coven, peopled and maintained exclusively by and for the clergy. Women religious can find one more into the ladies' coven, maintained in a similar way. We know, too, that in many public schools in any major city, it is a virtual surety that there is at least one group of teenagers engaged in the ritualistic adoration of the devil. And though we know very little, again for obvious reasons, about human sacrifice as an element in ritualistic Satanism, we do know that in certain covens in which confidentiality is an absolute, life or death condition, the penalty for attempting to quit the coven is being the subject of being ritually offered yourself by knife, with one such use of that implement inflicted for every year of the offending member's life. Hard admissible evidence concerning the sacrifice of a person as an element in Satanist rituals is limited by the fact that disposal of a person has been developed into one of the dark art forms within Satanist circles through use of portable incinerators and crematoria. And because there are no birth or baptismal records, no records of existence of intended offerings of the most vulnerable and most young. Nevertheless, we have enormous amounts of anecdotal evidence indicating that some thousands of the most vulnerable are intentionally conceived and then birthed to serve as the offerings in Satanist ritualistic rites. In the world of Satanist worship, boys are preferred as the physical replicas of the Christ child, but girls are by no means excluded. In this regard, the emergence of the McCarrick-type offenses as a characteristic of our time must claim particular attention. Not all, perhaps not even most of these kinds of offenses originate in ritualistic Satanism per se. Each case must be weighed on the evidence. For the extent of McCarrick offenses in America today and the concrete evidence of the following of Satan as a factor in many such cases begins to give some idea of the degree to which the inverted standards that are the prime hallmark of satanic activity in any form, and of ritualistic satanic activity above all, have infiltrated and influenced all levels of our society. As horrifying as even that much information is, though it is not all of the information we have by any means, still more shocking is the realization of the fact that in this, the America of the 1990s, one is never far from a center where such activities are carried out on a routine basis. No one lives far from some geographic area where some form of the ritualistic worship of the devil is practiced. Devil worship and its inevitable consequences, demonic possession, are now part and parcel of the atmosphere of life in America. That a more favorable climate exists now than ever before for the occurrence of demonic possession among the general population is so clear that it is attested to daily by competent social and psychological experts, who for the most part appear to have no religious bias. Our cultural desolation, a kind of agony of aimlessness coupled with a dominant self-interest, is documented for us in the disintegration of our families, in the breakup of our educational system, in the disappearance of publicly accepted norms of decency and language, dress and behavior, in the lives of our youth, everywhere deformed by stunning violence and by the sudden end of existence, by teenagers being ready to become parents, by the use of substances, by disease, by the self-removal, and by fear. America is arguably now the most violent of the so-called developed nations of the world. Parents do have every reason to be concerned then, for above all, the greatest changes in the conditions which we have come to live over the past 20 years or so have meant that young people are left as the most defenseless against the possibility of possession. Raised more and more in an atmosphere where moral criticism is not merely out of fashion but prohibited, they swim with little help in a veritable sea of impure films. Not merely of the kind designed to stir up the flesh, but of the kind that is of unmitigated self-interest, whether spoken or acted. Just as the practical impact of large numbers of faithful clergy among us was once so great, so now are the practical consequences for all us, believers and non-believers alike, of large numbers of unfaithful churchmen. Among the general population of Catholics and Christians of other denominations, large numbers of people no longer learn even so basic a prayer as the Our Father. In churches and parochial schools alike, the subject of hell is avoided. As one Midwestern priest put it, in order not to put people on a guilt trip, the idea of sin is likewise avoided. According to the same source, in order not to do irreparable damage to what has been taught for the past 15 years. That much alone leaves every Christian at a profound and needless disadvantage in the confrontation with evil that life brings to each of us. Deeply felt prohibitions against mixing what is termed the rational with the faith that is necessary for the recognition of evil is, for many, an insurmountable obstacle. And without the grace that is born of true faith, Satan does what he does best. He ceases to exist in the eyes of those who do not see. Still, the most dramatic and immediate harm by far that results from such an extensive and pervasive lack of instruction falls upon the true and valid victims of possession, the individual victims of personal evil in their thousands. The Church is the only element in society with the authority and the availing remedy to counteract such manifest evil. If then the officials charged with this basic duty of the Church deny the very legacy of that Church, they turn their backs even on scriptural descriptions of Christ casting out demons, if they characterize those accounts as false and as literary license, then actual victims of true demonic activity are left with no hope. If the salt has lost its saltiness, St. Mark quotes Christ, wherewith will you season it? Have you salt in yourselves, and have peace with another? In a nutshell, that is the condition of some of our clergy, and it is the plight of the possessed in America of the 1990s. If the Church Fathers no longer believe, then victims of demonic possession have nowhere to turn. They have no place to seek help they require, and to which they have every right as afflicted Christians. The circle of helplessness and suffering caused by such unfaith among churchmen does not stop with ordinary Christians and with the possessed, however. It widens much farther. Because of the nature of the outrages that occur in the course of the ritualistic worship of the devil, some extreme cases of McCarrick offenses and of just repeated endings of life are but too ready examples. Officers of the law frequently enter the picture, faced with undeniable evidence of a devilish context, evidence such as pentagrams, broken crucifixes, Satanist graffiti, and other such paraphernalia. Law officers were once able to call in the help of clergymen expert in dealing with demonic possession. Such help is rarely available today. Rather, ignorance, disinterest, disbelief, even adamant unwillingness on the part of many church officials to do so much as discuss demonic possession and exorcism is literally the order of the day. In point of fact, in the Roman Catholic Church, the order of exorcist, part of every priest's ordination since time immemorial, has been omitted from the new rite of priestly ordination, as drawn up by the innovators after 1964 in the wake of the Second Vatican Council. Because both demonic possession and its remedy, the rite of exorcism, are thus seen by many officials and their advisors to be irrelevant, to be as negligible as, say, training in the use of a medieval astrolabe. Many Catholic dioceses, large and small in the United States, have no official exorcist. In some of the more fortunate dioceses where priests bring in ad hoc exorcists from out of town, the bishops of those dioceses know nothing and want to know less. But if they are not exactly benign, at least they turn a blind eye, and as permission of the bishop is required for exorcism to proceed, that blind eye can be and is taken as tacit permission. In other dioceses, however, bishops are expressly opposed to the rite of exorcism. Even in such situations, there are priests who still bring exorcists from out of town. Their canonical justification even here is that bishop has given presumed permission. That is, if the bishop believed what he should have believed as bishop, and further, if he knew about and recognized as valid a particular case of demonic possession, then it could be assumed he would authorize the exorcism. Such theological reasoning and canonical shenanigans are not only mental mind games. They present a scenario that comes right out of the catacombs, for the result is what can only be called an exorcism underground. A group of priests in one diocese networks in guarded secrecy with those of other dioceses in order to fulfill their obligations to the faithful in need. Ecclesiastically, the situation gives rise to irregularities, to be sure. It also leads in some cases to unjustly imposed canonical sanctions by irate and unbelieving bishops who maintain that their authority is thus being flouted. Even in such difficult circumstances, however, the incidence of exorcism has been on a steady rise. There has been a 750% increase in the number of exorcisms performed between the early 1960s and the mid-1970s. Over the same period, there has been an alarming increase in the number of requested possessions, that is, cases in which the possessed formally request Satan to possess them, in comparison to the cases of incurred possessions which result from other sorts of activities of the possessed that facilitate possession. Each year, some 800 to 1,300 major exorcisms and some thousands of minor exorcisms are performed. For experts in the field, this is a sobering barometer of the increase in known cases of possession. But it is still more sobering to realize how many cases of possession cannot be addressed at all. The thousands of letters I receive from people who are desperate for help, Catholic, Protestant, evangelical, and unchurched, are eloquent, anguished, and a steadily mounting testimony to the crisis. Law officers, meanwhile, are increasingly confronted on every side by the incontrovertible sign of crimes committed in the course of the worship of the devil, or as grisly result of an individual's participation in such rituals. They are very often left out of the shrunken loop of expert advice and assistance that was once routinely to be found. To those who are active in the field of exorcism, and who therefore require a greater than usual ability to uncover and recognize the marks of the ritualistic worship of the devil for what they are, it is clear that in many police precincts, the Satanist character of a crime is either relegated to the background or not mentioned at all, at least in the public reports. By and large, the police have no other choice. They have neither competence nor authority in the rarefied and dangerous field of the behavior of the devil worshippers. Beyond the fact that a meaningless recounting of Satanist details often inspires imitation, any attempt by an officer or by anyone, including a trained and authorized exorcist, as the 5 cases recounted in this book make clear to free an individual from a possessing demon, places the aspiring rescuer in great danger of a demonic attack. A similar lack of help is faced as well by therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, and others who, like police, must deal with aberrant individuals. For within the present context of life in America, the probability of possession having occurred in overly sadistic or otherwise violent antisocial individuals is impressively high. Like I said at the beginning, I believe the subject of exorcisms and exorcists and the rest of it is a useful subject for reminding us of the spiritual warfare that we are surrounded by, that we are the subjects of, that is our souls the demons fight over, that they want to drag to eternal perdition with them. That is the most useful aspect of this subject, and really, not the sensational details of individual exorcisms. That's why I'm not going to go further into this book of Malachi Martin's on this channel. If you want to read it, go for it. It is one of the hardest things you will ever read, because the stories he recounts, the 4 or 5 individual exorcisms that he details, are hard to read. They're deeply disturbing for many people. If you're interested in that kind of thing, it's probably the easiest book of his to find, one of the few that they still actively print copies of. But for the rest of us, in general, the subject of exorcisms is basically left to the essentially dramatic, not dramatic and fake, but dramatic as in it's just dramatic, accounts of what it is in the most worst cases you might deal with. A reminder of the very real nature of the demonic and how it is out there, how the devil truly is, like a lion prowling about the world, seeking souls to devour. I'm curious what you thought of this. Let me know in the comments, please. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help. So does sharing this on social media. That helps too. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.